Hello, a very good evening. It is 8:03 on LBC. Welcome to the programme if you've just tuned in. We're streaming this hour as well if you'd like to watch us on Global Player. The reason we're doing so is because we're joined by Benedict Rodgers, human rights activist. He's the chair of Hong Kong Watch and author of the new book, The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny. And Benedict, welcome back. It's a good week to have you in, actually, isn't it? Because, of course, the Foreign Secretary devoted, I think, his whole Mansion House speech to talking about what Britain's policy towards China should be in the future. And it was a much more emollient speech, I suppose. I mean, some would say maybe he was being just realistic, but it was being much more pro keeping up relations with China than maybe some of his Conservative Party colleagues might have wished. It wasn't quite going back to the days of David Cameron and George Osborne, who wanted a much closer relationship with China, but it was certainly a lot more emollient than maybe his two or three predecessors have been. Would you accept that?
I would indeed. I mean, it was certainly better than the Golden Era rhetoric, and it was better than what we heard from Emmanuel Macron when he was in China recently. But it was, I think the problem with it is that there's really no strategy to it. I mean, there are a lot of words in his speech that I would agree with. But it was rather sort of motherhood and apple pie. You know, we'll defend national security, we'll defend our values, but we'll also be friends with Beijing. Well, I think we have to make a choice. And also, he didn't really spell out in practical terms how we'll defend our security and values.
So it was sort of, he would probably describe it as realpolitik, just saying, well, look, they are a superpower. They are one of the world's leading economic powers. We have mutual interest with them. It would be ridiculous, as he put it, to put the shutters up.
Well, I know of very few people that are actually advocating putting the shutters up. I don't think anyone is saying we shouldn't talk to Beijing. We can't not talk to them. They are, whether we like it or not, a major global power. But the question is, on whose terms is our engagement, and what is the purpose of the engagement, and what are the repercussions when they behave in ways that are unacceptable for the international community and for our national security?
Well, what should be the repercussions? Because it's very difficult in that you look at, as I said, we talked about Taiwan last week on the show, but you look at if they decided to invade Taiwan, and there are, I think, more than a few indications that is the long-term aim if the Taiwanese government doesn't play ball, and there's nothing we could do about that, and we have to accept that, don't we?
No, I don't agree with that. I think, of course, the United Kingdom on its own is limited in what we can do. But with our allies, we should be sending all the strongest possible messages in advance in order to deter an invasion, that should an invasion take place, we will stand with Taiwan. That doesn't
and do what?
Well, I think the United States would almost certainly defend Taiwan militarily.
Really?
I think that's very likely.
How?
I mean, the indications that President Biden has made suggest that. I think the build-up of naval vessels in the region, of course, the AUKUS network is a significant initiative in that direction. So I think the UK, if we're to stay true to our allies and to our values of democracy, we would have to be involved in supporting Taiwan. That doesn't mean British troops on the ground, but it does mean economic consequences for China, targeted sanctions, military equipment, and diplomatic actions.
The number to call if you'd like to put a question to Benedict on really anything to do with human rights, the Far East, China. I mean, you've been active all over the Far East in trying to sort of promote the concept of human rights. So there's a lot of ground to cover here. 0345 6060 973. Just on the practicalities of China's relationship with Taiwan. I mean, China maintains that Taiwan is an integral part of China. Now, we went through the history of this on the programme last week a little bit. Taiwan doesn't consider itself as that and operates effectively as an independent state, but it's not a member of the United Nations. And China reacts very badly to any country that seeks to even tiptoe towards recognising it as an independent state. I mean, was it last year or the year before when Nancy Pelosi turned up there? I mean, they went ballistic, didn't they? Why are they so sensitive?
Well, they're so sensitive for two reasons. Firstly, they believe their own propaganda that Taiwan is theirs and one day will be, in their terms, reunited with the motherland. But also, of course, Taiwan is the exact opposite of mainland China today in the sense that it's a vibrant democracy with a free press, a civil society, the rule of law. It's one of the most impressive democracies in Asia. And obviously they hate that and they want to incorporate it into their authoritarian, repressive communist system.
And there's no prospect of that happening voluntarily, is it? I mean, if there was a referendum on Taiwan, I've got no idea I think I know what the result would be, but I don't know how emphatic it would be, whether it would be 99-1 or 90-10 or whatever. I mean, you maybe can enlighten us.
Yes, I think opinion in Taiwan in recent years has definitely hardened even further against any kind of voluntary unification. I mean, the concept that Deng Xiaoping came up with for Hong Kong of one country, two systems, and we'll perhaps talk about that later on, but that was actually, in the Chinese regime's mind, a model that they hoped would be attractive for Taiwan. But given that they've totally destroyed that model in Hong Kong, there's no reason why Taiwanese would be attracted to it. And the current president of Taiwan was re-elected a couple of years ago, having her poll ratings just prior to that were dipping, but they soared because of the crackdown in Hong Kong, and she was seen as a defender of Taiwan. Taiwanese people re-elected her because they don't want the one country, two systems model.
And in terms of a military invasion, as I understand it, and as I say, I've never been there, but I've got a couple of friends that live in Taiwan, they explained to me that the topography of Taiwan makes a physical land invasion actually quite difficult.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm no military strategist, but that's exactly what experts that I've spoken to have said. And I think that the intentions of Xi Jinping and Beijing are not in any doubt. The timing and manner of how they will try it is certainly unpredictable. And what they may be more likely to do is some kind of blockade of Taiwan rather than an actual invasion.
And do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has impacted at all on their thinking on this? Because I suspect they've always gone from the premise, well, if we want to do it, we'll do it, and sort of damn the consequences. It doesn't really matter what the international community thinks. And I mean, Taiwan isn't equipped to really fight us. But given the resistance in Ukraine to Russia, I wonder whether they might be reevaluating that now.
I think that's right. I think that they may well have seen that things have not gone Putin's way. They've also seen probably more resolve from the West than perhaps they expected. And I think that will give them pause for thought. It may well be that they will still pursue their intentions but learn lessons from Putin's mistakes. But all the more reason why the West should retain our resolve, because I think it's by showing our resolve that we may deter them from that action.
Just take us through where you've been active in the Far East and sort of promoting human rights and the consequences for you of what you've been saying.
Well, I've been involved in the region really ever since I was about 18 years old. I went to teach English in China when I was 18 for 6 months, and that's how I fell in love with China. And I always want to emphasize, I'm not anti-China. I love China as a country. It's the Chinese Communist Party that I oppose. But since then, I've been involved with Burma or Myanmar for many, many years, traveled there more than 50 times, been deported from Burma not once but twice. I've been involved with North Korea and other parts of Asia. And then in the last 10 years or so, I've really focused particularly on China and Hong Kong, been denied entry to Hong Kong. It was probably one of the first Westerners to have that happen. I've had threats from the Hong Kong police force with a jail sentence threatened. I've had threatening letters at my home in London, as have my neighbours and even my mother. So
from whom?
from anonymous. Well, so the letter from the police force was very clearly from the Hong Kong police. The letters at my home and to my mother were anonymous, but stamped and postmarked from Hong Kong.
And how do you react to that sort of thing?
When I received the first letter from Hong Kong, and even the fact that it was stamped from Hong Kong made me suspicious because nobody I knew in Hong Kong wrote to me by post or had my address. And when I opened it, it had a picture of me taken off the internet and the words "watch him," and it went to all of my neighbours' house in a suburb of London, which was a new way of getting to know my neighbours. And I think initially I was, of course, shocked, as you would be, and somewhat troubled by it.
How many did they send it to?
I think probably about 30, I would say.
And presumably one or two of them knocked on your door and
said... They
yeah.
did. And they'd actually Googled me, so they knew a bit of background and they were very supportive. But as time has gone on and I've had more of these kind of letters, my instinct is more to sort of laugh it off because it's so ridiculous. And I think the key thing is, yes, one should be aware and alert to threats, but one shouldn't do what the authors of these letters want me to do, which is to be paranoid and fearful and stop doing what I'm doing. So it actually causes me to want to redouble my efforts because they want me to give in to them.
Have you ever been really concerned for your safety?
I wouldn't say really concerned in a physical sense. Probably the closest I came to it was when I was traveling in Canada a couple of years ago. I was at a conference near Vancouver, and I received an anonymous email saying, "See you at," and it named the hotel that I was going to be staying at. And I did take security advice at that point. I was actually told that Vancouver was kind of ground zero in terms of Chinese Communist Party infiltration and that I should take it seriously. And so I discreetly changed my hotels and was briefed by Canadian security. But that's the closest I've come to it.
Well, lots more to talk to you about. I do want to hear from listeners as well. As I say, as you've just heard, Benedict knows a lot about Burma, Myanmar. Have you ever met Aung San Suu Kyi?
I have.
We'll talk about her, I think, because there's a new book coming out about her, which I got notice of the other day, which to me looked a bit of a hagiography, but I don't know. And more about China and what Britain's future relationship with China should be. 0345 6060 973. It's 60 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
8. Abby in Surrey has texted to say, is the China-Taiwan situation not akin to the Scotland-UK one? If so, why then does the UK not allow Scotland her independence? If you want Taiwan to be independent, then surely, if you want Taiwan to be China... Sorry, this is making no sense. If you want Taiwan to be independent from China, there is no analogy to be drawn there, surely, is there?
None whatsoever. I mean, I don't know if she missed the referendum we had some years ago, but we actually gave the people of Scotland a choice. It's possible we may have another referendum in due course, although the way the SNP is imploding, maybe not. But no, I mean, we have a democratic process. And I just make one point. I remember a few years ago there was an activist in Hong Kong who formed a party for Hong Kong independence, which isn't something I've ever advocated for. But I did defend his right to advocate for it, and on Twitter, and I got tweets back saying, "How would you feel if advocates for Scottish independence were allowed to do that?" I said they're the third largest party in our parliament.
It is bizarre, isn't it? If you want to ask Benedict a question about China, Hong Kong, Burma, Myanmar, about anything to do with that region and human rights, 0345 6060 973. Well, let's talk about Hong Kong, because I think the last time we talked, I just interviewed Nathan Law, the campaigner, who's been forced out of Hong Kong and now lives in London. One of the most inspirational people I think I've ever met. What's changed in Hong Kong over the last 12 months?
Well, I've known Nathan for several years. He's a good friend. He actually wrote the foreword to my book. What's changed is that people like Nathan have either been driven into exile or are in prison. I used to be in touch by phone pretty much every day with people in Hong Kong. I'm now in touch with almost no one because either they're in prison or it would endanger them if I was in touch. And the key thing is this draconian national security law that was imposed in 2020, which has just dismantled all basic freedoms. Freedom of the press has completely gone. The major newspapers that were speaking out, the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, the proprietor of the Apple Daily, is in jail, likely to be in jail for the rest of his life. All freedoms have been dismantled in Hong Kong.
And there's no prospect of that being reversed now, is there? I mean, one can shout all one wants, but it will never change now.
It will never change until the regime in Beijing changes. But yes, for the time being, it's gone.
And a lot of Hong Kong citizens have now come to Britain. I don't know how many, but was it Boris Johnson's government or Theresa May's? Boris Johnson's government allowed people to come here. How many people have taken advantage of that?
So approximately 150,000, we believe. There are potentially up to 3 million who are eligible under the British National Overseas Scheme. And I really give the government great credit for this. Hong Kong Watch started advocating for this when we were first founded. And I don't think we ever believed the government would be as generous and actually courageous as they were. So it has given 150,000 people a lifeline out of Hong Kong.
Because this has received no publicity, really. I mean, we talk about refugees from Ukraine, we talk about people coming from Afghanistan, war zones, but you very rarely read anything about people from Hong Kong. Why is that?
I think there was some publicity when it was first announced and in the early sort of phase of the programme. But I think probably one of the reasons we don't hear about it is in a sense we only hear about things when it's bad news. And actually the situation in Hong Kong is very bad news, but Hong Kongers coming to this country is actually in the circumstances good news. It's good news for them that it gives them a lifeline to freedom. But by and large, they're people who are a great benefit to this country. They come with great skills. They're entrepreneurial. They're dynamic. They integrate well. They're settling in well. And so that's they're just getting on with it. So maybe that's why we don't hear about it.
And has our relationship with Hong Kong changed in any meaningful way? I mean, I think there are still British judges on the Hong Kong Supreme Court, which to me seems very odd given the circumstances.
Yes, I mean, I think whilst I give credit to the government for the BNO scheme, I think it is outrageous that there have been no consequences for the Hong Kong government or the Chinese government for completely breaking an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration. So there have been no sanctions. The US has introduced sanctions, we haven't. There are still we did remove the sitting judges, but the retired judges are free to continue, and people like Lord Sumption continues. We've just had recently the visit of the Hong Kong Secretary for Financial Services, Christopher Hui, who is the man who's actually responsible for denying Hong Kongers leaving Hong Kong to come to Britain access to their pension funds, basically in retaliation for the British government scheme. And what happens, he comes to the UK, he meets 3 ministers, he makes a speech in the Guildhall. I made a speech outside the Guildhall while he was speaking at a protest. But it does appear that there's a sort of sense of wanting to get back to business as usual, and business in Hong Kong is very far from.
That's incredible, because they must have known what he had done. Similarly, I find it incomprehensible how the man who enforced the security crackdown in Hong Kong can be invited to the coronation.
Absolutely. I mean, that feels like a real insult to Hong Kongers, to Britain, to the King, and to the principals.
Well, he must have been invited by the palace, presumably, or did they just send a general invitation and the Chinese government choose who they're going to send?
I don't know the details of how it happened. I suspect it was probably a general invitation and the Chinese decided to send him, but I assume also the Foreign Office would have had some involvement.
Apparently it was a general invite, according to the Foreign Secretary. So what you said about it being a deliberate snub, it is, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think
things aren't coincidental.
Exactly. And as he's the architect of the crackdown in Hong Kong, he's exactly the sort of person we should be sanctioning, not welcoming to the coronation.
Let's go to a call if you'd like to put your headphones on. David is in Uxbridge. Hello, David.
Yes, hi, Ian. And I'm going to ask a question. I'm sure your panel might not agree with it, but I'd like to put a point that, and it's basically quoting Jeffrey Sachs, the leading American economist, and he's saying America, in particular in the West, should have a different policy to China, and it should push back from its kind of policy of promoting preeminence or the leading, because the reality is we now live in a multipolar world, and that we should work with China and we should accept we live, because you look at the global south, they're, have close links with China, and we should accept that rather than going down the Biden policy of containment and competition, because that can lead into a Cold War. So I'd like to put that point that we should have more accepting of a multipolar world, and that we have 2 leading powers now. We have America and the dollar, and we now have China, and we should accept a world with that. Because I'm not saying the human rights things aren't real, but I don't think they're the main concern, because there's loads of countries that have appalling human rights record that we're absolutely happy to do business with. So I want to say it's that point and hear what your guests can come back to.
Benedict.
Yeah. Well, I would say 3 quick things. Firstly, on the question of Cold War, whether you use that term or not, it's actually Xi Jinping who has declared that hostility to the West himself. If you read any of his speeches, he has talked about China's hostility to our values. So it's not us declaring a Cold War against him. He's created those circumstances. Secondly, I think when it comes, of course I agree that there are many regimes committing human rights abuses, and we have to be realistic. And as I said earlier, I'm not saying we shouldn't engage with China, but we do have to remember that this is a regime that has broken its promises over Hong Kong, has been credibly accused of genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, continues atrocities in Tibet, threatens our freedoms, and we can explore the ways that happens, and is increasingly threatening Taiwan. So it is not a regime that is a friend.
But do you accept David's point that our government is adopting, or seems to be, after James Cleverly's speech, seems to be adopting a rather different policy to that of the United States?
It does appear that way, at least on the surface, and I am concerned about divisions among the free world. This is a time where the free world should be united, and to use a phrase, the Chinese Communist Party has what it calls its united front that is designed to wage sort of propaganda war and influence. We should be building our united front to confront that.
And what about the number of Chinese students there are in this country, which some educational institutions, several universities, could not exist without the money that Chinese students are bringing? What is the influence of China in our universities, and is it generally positive, or can it be very corrosive as well?
I think it's hugely significant. I would never want us to be in a position of saying we shouldn't have students from any country. We shouldn't discriminate against students because of their country. But I think we should be looking very carefully at what influence they're having, what disciplines we may be training them in. Chinese students studying the humanities may well be a very good thing, but if we're transferring scientific research and technology that may well be used against us one day, and particularly, a few weeks ago, The Times broke a story about the number of universities engaged in research projects with Chinese military institutions and Chinese hackers and Chinese people involved in espionage. Those are things we should certainly be addressing. We should be diversifying funding sources for universities. And lastly, I think the role of Confucius Institutes, which are basically a Chinese Communist Party propaganda outfit. Rishi Sunak said in his leadership campaign, his first one, that he was going to ban them. James Cleverly, I think, yesterday announced they were going to stop funding them. Well, my question is, why were we funding them in the first place? But the government has not delivered on that promise to shut them down.
Right, David, thank you very much for your call. We'll take more of your calls in a moment as well. And we'll talk a little bit about Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, Burma. Are we still allowed to call it Burma, or is that considered a bit colonial?
Well, people might think it's colonial. Actually, it's many of the Burmese democracy movement that still want us to use Burma because they say the military regime had no right to change the name of the country.
I'm going to use Burma then. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. Let's get some news headlines on LBC. It's 8:31. Here's Daryl Jackson.
Detectives in Glasgow who've been searching for the partner of murdered teacher Morel Sturrock have found a body. Police say formal identification hasn't been completed, but officers do believe it's to be 36-year-old David Yates. The Sudanese army has agreed to extend a 72-hour ceasefire for a further 72 hours. Tens of thousands have already left the northeast African country in the past few days, including nearly 900 on RAF flights. And the RMT unions confirmed a fresh rail strike for the day of the Eurovision Song Contest final in Liverpool. A group of drivers said earlier they'll be walking out the day before that and the FA Cup final on the 3rd of June. LBC weather: rain moving into much of Wales and northern England overnight. More rain across the far north too, and a low of 3.
This is LBC.
Benedict Rodgers is with us, the author of a new book called The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny. Paul is in Streatham. Hello, Paul.
Hello there. I'm a bit nervous. Who is your speaker speaking with you?
Benedict Rodgers. He's a human rights campaigner.
I'm trying to put myself in the Chinese shoes, yeah? They lost 30 million people in World War II fighting Japanese Nazis, okay? So they're a bit paranoid about having Taiwan turn into another military base for the Americans, yeah? The Americans sold £2 billion worth of weaponry last year and under Donald Trump, and they're promising to send more weapons into Taiwan, yeah? The Japanese used Taiwan as a military base to bomb Manchuria. They enslaved 5 million Chinese people. We never lost 30 million people in World War II. So I believe that the Chinese are paranoid, yeah, and quite rightly. The Americans send their military armada every other year into the South China Sea. Rishi Sunak went to Japan and negotiated that British troops could land in Japan and Japanese troops could land in Britain. What is all that about? And then the Americans and the British sell 5 nuclear submarines, $250 billion worth of equipment to Australia. The Chinese are a peaceful people. The last thing that they want is war. They are the adults in the room. They have done everything to try and stop this rhetoric ramping up of hostility.
So basically the Americans are to blame as usual. Presumably you therefore support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, thinking that it's America's fault.
No, I just want peace. I just want to stop the bombing of black and yellow people. That's what I want to stop.
Well, you're talking as if American weapons or Western weapons have been forced on the government of Taiwan, who presumably requested them because they want to defend themselves against the tyranny of the Communist Party of China.
It's good that you mentioned that, because when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, yeah, there were many protests in Taiwan, and then they had an election 2 or 3 months later, and she went on the campaign that, she's hard on China. She's hard on China. What happened in the election? She lost. She had to resign as the president of the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, right? And they're going to have elections in 8 months' time. And many people in Taiwan are actually coming out of the woodwork, and they're saying, look, we don't want war. We're not going to be the next...
But nobody wants war. I mean, why would anyone in their right mind want war? The only people threatening war are the Chinese government.
How are the Chinese... Iain, with all respect, I listen to you, yeah? And I just believe that you're just prepping the British people for war.
No.
You're talking about TikTok. What the hell is... TikTok has got nothing to do with it. Chipsets.
I haven't mentioned TikTok yet, but I'm going to soon.
This is nothing to do with that for the Chinese people. They have been humiliated for 150 years, okay, with opium forced upon them, Hong Kong stolen, Macau stolen.
Hong Kong wasn't stolen.
Hong Kong was stolen for 50 years without any negotiation, and then they had opium forced into their country by the British, right? Because the British wanted to drum up trade. The Chinese were buying tea, silk, and China, and British didn't like it, so they drum up a trade, a foreign a drug trade, in order to balance the books, right? And then after 50 years, they negotiated a 99-year lease, yeah, gunship diplomacy. That's how HSBC Bank was created. So
basically what you're saying is Britain evil, United States evil, but communist China, all they want is peace.
No, what I tell you is this is the facts. China has not invaded anybody in the last, I don't know how many hundreds of years, right? That is fact. They defended themselves in the Vietnam War against another American base on their borders. But the Chinese people are not going around the world killing people and assassinating people, blowing up infrastructure projects. They're not doing those things.
Okay, all right. Let's have a word from Benedict, because I've done my best to persuade you that you're wrong, but you're not having it from me. So let's see if you can have it from him.
Well, I just make 2 points. The first is I agree with you when you say the Chinese people are broadly a peaceful people, but what we're talking about here is the Chinese Communist Party regime, which is definitely not a peaceful regime. But secondly, I have to correct you. You said it hasn't invaded anybody. It invaded Tibet in 1950. The Dalai Lama, who I met recently in Dharamsala, has been in exile for all these years since then. And it invaded what was known as East Turkestan, that the Chinese now call Xinjiang, and they've incarcerated millions of Uyghurs now in concentration camps in that region of Xinjiang. And those are two large territories that the Chinese Communist Party invaded.
You say invaded, that's their territory, right? If you go to Shanghai, you see the French concession, the British concession, the Dutch concession. Russia stole some of their land. Yeah, everyone had a free fall. Japanese invaded them. That's why the people are paranoid. It means more than just chipsets and TikTok to the Chinese. All of this confrontation. I just want peace. I don't want to be prepped for another war. I don't want the.
Well, all you're doing is repeating yourself. You're just repeating yourself now. You haven't addressed the points that Benedict made about Xinjiang and Tibet.
Well, listen. I've been to China. I've been to Taiwan. I've been to Japan. Yeah, and for me, it's not even about that. It's just the countless wars we have to get involved in.
All right. Well, address the point. You keep saying that all China wants is peace, and you're not answering the point that Benedict put to you, where he showed two examples of where that's clearly not the case.
What, Tibet?
Tibet and Xinjiang.
I don't know about Xinjiang, right? But I do know Tibet was used by the Americans again.
Oh, so it's the Americans again. You're obsessed. You're obsessed by your hatred of the United States.
Listen, the facts are this, right? The facts are this.
They're your opinions. You're stating very few facts.
I put facts to you. Right? Don't cut me off then. Let me.
I haven't cut you off. You've had about 5 minutes so far, which is more than callers normally get.
And I respect you for that, because I didn't think you even give me a minute.
I'm in a tolerant mood. Go on, carry on.
Look, we have outsourced our military to the Americans. We have 60,000 troops. We couldn't do anything against China.
We have 78,000 troops.
Oh, 78,000, that's including all the secretaries and all the cleaners.
No, it's not. That's soldiers.
Okay, I'm not disrespecting the British Army, yeah? They're some of the best army in the world. But it's the leaders, yeah? Whenever America says we have to go to war, we haven't even finished the war in Ukraine, and they're talking about another war with China. The Chinese are not stupid.
But we're not talking about that. You're talking about it, but no normal person is talking about that. The British government isn't talking about that.
The Chinese know if it wasn't for the Russians and their war, China would be number one on the chopping block. An American colonel in the Navy said, we will be at war with China in the next 2 years. Right? And the reason why he said that was, if we leave China alone, they will be too big to confront on their borders. Another 5-10 years, China will be too big. So every military computer will say, no, we cannot beat China on their borders. Right? But for the Chinese, President Xi said, okay, I envisage Taiwan and China, mainland China, having a peaceful reunification by 2050. He kicked it into the long grass until Nancy Pelosi turned up and stirred the hornet's nest. And by the way, that's Tai Ing-wen in China. She has been talking to the Americans since the beginning of the early 2000s, right? But beginning this century. She is a puppet for the Americans. The vast majority of Taiwanese people on that island believe that they know they're Chinese because they're part of the Han people, the Hakka people of China.
No one disputes that they're ethnically Chinese.
Okay, right? And the vast majority of people want the status quo. Yeah, because they enjoy peace.
Exactly. So why shouldn't they have it?
They enjoy. What I told you, President Xi said, kick it into the long grass. Yeah.
I think to be fair, I think, and Benedict, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think he said he wants a reunification by 2030.
That's exactly right. And he's presided over the most significant military build-up in Chinese...
And he's got every right to say, I would like Taiwan to be reunited with China. I've got absolutely no problem with him saying that, but it's got to be surely the people of Taiwan to decide that.
Well, listen, you can't have hypocritical standards, right? You can't tell China, oh, don't get involved in our politics. But this guy, Mr. Benedict, no disrespect, who are you to go into China as a Caucasian person and tell the Chinese how to conduct their business inside their borders? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's like colonial powers ganging up Australia, Britain. Who else? Oh, what are the German Nazis doing in the South China Sea, linking up with
German
Japanese...
Nazis?
What? Japanese warships?
Sorry. No. You said the German Nazis, which makes my finger hover over the fader button to cut you off, because that is an outrageous thing to say.
Listen. Not to the Chinese. They had to.
Just justify what you've just said, and if you can't justify it, I'll end the conversation.
I'll justify it. What are German ships, naval ships, doing linking up with Japanese naval ships in the South China Sea? I mean, if I was Chinese, I'd be so...
The South China Sea is international waters, most of it.
No, the reason why China built the Belt and Road Initiative is because every year the Americans pretend they're going to blockade the South China Sea and cut off resources into China. So China are the adults. They said,
are you being paid by the Chinese government, Paul? Because that's what I suspect.
The Chinese said, OK, then we're going to build the Belt and Road Initiative so we can come out of China and into Africa and into the rest of the world. So you can't keep us off.
Are you a paid propagandist for the Chinese Communist Party?
Listen, you have my phone number. You know where to find me. And then you can tell me if I'm a propagandist for anybody.
Well, you sound very much like it. That's all I'm saying.
No, you are the facilitator for the redneck neocons. You are the facilitator. Yes, you are.
Oh, well, I'm glad to learn that.
Because every time you're just ramping up the rhetoric on China. But it's not your kids that are going to go to war.
No, all I'm doing is trying to learn about China and Taiwan and to try and make an educated judgment as to who's wanting what and why. And that's what I'm trying to encourage my listeners to take an interest in this subject, because I realise it's not necessarily the thing that's on the tip of everybody's tongue, but because of the threats made by the Chinese government, I suspect it might be one day soon.
What threats? It's Biden making threats that he will defend Taiwan.
It's America.
Listen,
you know, Paul, I've got several people texting me saying, "Get him off the radio." You've now had 9 minutes. I'm 3 minutes late for a break. Will you allow me to cut you off now?
You know my phone number. I give you a lot of respect. I give you a lot of respect because I didn't anticipate you would give me any airtime. Whenever you speak about American foreign policy, you get cut off. But listen...
No, that's not true. That is simply not true. I nearly did cut you off when you said the Germans were Nazis, because I think that's a deeply insulting thing to say and totally unjustifiable. But hey, as I say, I'm in a tolerant mood tonight. It's 8:48.
This is LBC.
Josh says, he's from Liverpool. He says, the last caller misrepresents how ruthless the Chinese can be. And occasionally, I think that if that mindset continues, more people will end up in concentration camps for having alternative views to the Chinese Communist Party. Benedict Rodgers, you sat there very patiently listening to that. Let me do all the heavy lifting, I notice. I mean, how prevalent do you think that kind of viewpoint is in this country?
I don't think it's very prevalent. I think, I come across occasionally voices like that. There are also voices like that among expats still living in Hong Kong who are pretty much in the pay of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not saying definitively that caller was, but no, the vast majority of people I talk to, the more they learn about the situation, the more concerned they get, rightly so.
But his point about what business is it of yours to try and interfere in the sort of affairs of China?
Well, I think there are two reasons for doing so. The first is that there are international human rights obligations that every country signs up to, and therefore those are of universal concern, and it's right for anybody who believes in freedom and human rights to speak up. I have many friends in China, so I'm speaking up for them. As I said earlier, I'm pro-China. I'm just anti the Chinese regime. But also the Chinese Communist Party regime is increasingly a threat to us in terms of its influence, its intimidation, its coercion within our own society. And if we don't stand up to it, our own freedoms are at risk.
Lots of you getting in touch to say how much you disagree with Paul there. Quite a few of you saying, please get him off the air. He's off the air now. I possibly shouldn't have let that go on for as long as I did, but I have to say I was quite enjoying it in a perverse sort of way. Right, we haven't got long left, so I do want to touch on Burma and what's going on there, because I always regarded Aung San Suu Kyi as almost a saint until recently, because of her attitude to the Rohingya Muslims. She's now essentially in prison. Is she actually in prison or not under house arrest?
Yeah, no, she's in prison now.
What went wrong there?
Well, it was obviously absolutely tragic. I think it's an example of a situation where we put her on a pedestal and far too much. She certainly disappointed us. Of course, she had really difficult decisions to make when she was sharing power with the military. And one could have understood, it would have been difficult, but one could have understood if she'd stayed quiet on the issue. But she didn't. She actually spoke up defending the military, and that was unacceptable. And of course, she did that in the hope of continuing in power. And look where that led her. The military didn't.
Why? Why did they go against her?
I think essentially the commander-in-chief, General Min Aung Hlaing, wanted to be president. When he couldn't win at the ballot box in 2020, he decided to overturn the elections and take power himself. I think he was also perhaps concerned about his and other military assets, and he wanted to protect those assets. He was concerned about the risk of one day being held accountable for the Rohingya genocide. And in order to prevent all that, he wanted direct power.
Right, let's go to Robin in Lancaster. Hi, Robin. Oh, sorry, Lambeth. Robin, hi.
Oh, okay, hi. When you said Lancaster, sorry. I'm really sorry. I thought...
No, my eyesight is a bit dodgy today, so apologies for that. What would you like to ask?
No, what I really want to say is that, China is right now one of the most powerful countries in the world, like a superpower. And what we're doing as a Britain is we're not there yet. We're not ready to tackle any of them. Because, look, myself, I called the other day on your radio station. I did explain I'm doing 3 jobs, still with, living on food bank. And there's many people like me, we're relying on food bank even till today. And the Bank of England just said to us the other day, we have to be poorer. We have no choice, as you know better than me. So I think we should concentrate on us internally here rather than going outside and trying to fight China or Russia.
But nobody's saying we want to fight China. I mean, I don't know where this impression is being given. It's certainly not been given on my programme that we want to fight China. But when China does things that are antipathetic to the interests of this country or indeed our allies, then we have to surely stand up and at least say so.
But can I just mention all this public domain and the radio that we listen in car or at home or whatever? It seems like we are always anti-Russia and anti-China. Why can't we be ever anti-USA? Because they're the one who's going to every country and raping people, taking the land, taking the money,
here we go
and
again.
all of that.
Here we go again.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to blame anyone. What I'm saying, the reality
You
is...
just accused America of going and raping people. I mean, that's a pretty disgusting thing to say.
No, it happened in Iraq. How come it's disgusting? Have you seen the report from Iraq? Have you seen a film called Green Zone? Please, you're a radio presenter. You should know all this.
I'm well aware that military from all countries go over the top and do some pretty despicable things. But why is it that people like you just pick on America, just like our last caller? Everything is always the fault of the Americans. The Americans have defended this country from tyranny over successive decades. And, sometimes it might be nice if people like you acknowledge that. Let's finish off, Benedict, with just a quick word about TikTok, which obviously is something that is very popular among young people. I've deleted it from my phone because when I learned what could happen, it clearly can be used as an instrument of the Chinese government. I thought, I don't really want to be part of that. But I still have a TikTok account that someone manages for me. I just never see what goes on it. Why are we so afraid of TikTok nowadays?
Well, you're absolutely right to have done what you've done. The government has also banned government devices from having TikTok, so has Parliament. There are two basic concerns. The first is that it is very closely linked to the Chinese Communist Party regime and at times has been used to spread the party's propaganda, particularly about the genocide against the Uyghurs. But secondly, in terms of how it affects us, the data that goes out from us on TikTok could very well end up in the hands of the regime in Beijing.
But why would they care what some teenager has on their phone?
Well, I think all of us, whether we're public people like you and me or just an ordinary teenager, there is personal information that China can use to build a picture of our movements, our interests, and that at some point can be used for mendacious and adverse purposes.
We have to finish there. We could go on for another hour, I think, but we'd better stop. Benedict Rodgers' book is called The China Nexus, 30 Years in and Around the Chinese Communist Party's Tyranny. It's out now. Do go and buy it and have a read of it. Benedict, thank you for coming in.